Hello and welcome. If you listened to my previous podcast on ADHD management in adults, thank you for joining me again. Today I want to talk about ADHD in children, not simply the diagnostic criteria or referral pathways, but the real-life experiences of children and families trying to navigate a world that often misunderstands them. In my previous podcast, I spoke largely as a GP with an interest in ADHD and neurodevelopmental disorders. But today, I also want to speak as a parent. My daughter has both autism and ADHD, and living alongside that complexity has shown me just how nuanced and emotionally exhausting neurodevelopmental disorders can be for families. However, today's discussion is specifically focused on ADHD in children because that's the focus of the article we're discussing. In the article, I described the fictional case of Ella, but the truth is, Ella was not entirely fictional. Much of her story was inspired by my own daughter and our family's experiences navigating school difficulties, emotional dysregulation, masking, anxiety, and trying to access support in an increasingly overwhelmed system. As a parent, I've found this journey incredibly difficult at times. There have been challenges at home, challenges at school, moments of emotional overwhelm, periods where we genuinely felt lost trying to navigate fragmented services and long waiting lists. In the previous podcast, I mentioned that my daughter was doing well, and in many ways she still is. She's bright, funny, caring, and incredibly resilient, but unfortunately the medication she trialled was simply not right for her. In fact, it worsened her mental health significantly. One thing this journey has taught me is that medication choices in ADHD are incredibly individual. What works brilliantly for one child may not work at all for another. Some children respond positively very quickly, while for others it can take time to find the right medication, the right dose, or sometimes to recognise that a particular treatment is simply not the right fit. I think that is important for families to hear, because when medication does not work immediately, parents often feel frightened or disheartened. ADHD management is rarely a one-size-fits-all process, and treatment journeys can look very different from one child to another. Watching your child deteriorate emotionally while hoping treatment will help is something no parent is ever really prepared for. The reality is that NHS waiting lists are now so extensive that we felt we had little option other than returning to private psychiatry and CAMHS. I recognise that I am fortunate to be in a position where I can afford to do that. Many families cannot. Many are left waiting months or years while their children continue struggling emotionally, socially, and academically. So today I'm speaking not only as a GP, but as a parent who has sat on the other side of the consultation room. I know what it feels like to desperately want someone to listen. I know how exhausting it is constantly advocating for your child. I know the emotional complexity of seeing how differently children can present across environments. My daughter would often try incredibly hard to mask around me and contain her emotions, but when she returned home to her mum, where she perhaps felt safest emotionally, everything would come out. The emotional overwhelm, dysregulation, and exhaustion after holding things together all day could be incredibly difficult for her mum. And I think many separated parents navigating neurodevelopmental disorders will recognise that dynamic. Watching that unfold as a father has been incredibly emotional at times, because underneath all of it is a child trying desperately to navigate a world that often misunderstands her. At one point, my daughter wrote down how ADHD felt to her, and one line has always stayed with me. She wrote, "I try really hard to focus and be normal, but I mess up anyway, and people think I'm not trying." And I think that sentence captures something many children with ADHD experience every single day. So often these children are labelled lazy, disruptive or difficult, when in reality many are trying harder than anyone around them realises. Another line she wrote was, "Sometimes I know what I want to do, but my body won't listen." As clinicians and parents, I think we sometimes underestimate just how frustrating and emotionally exhausting that internal experience can be for children. And I think that is why this matters to me so much personally. I never want children growing up believing they are broken because their brains work differently. I want my daughter and every child like her to know that being different is perfectly normal. You have often felt misunderstood, and I'm sorry you did not receive the support you needed earlier, but I'm proud of you every single day, and I love you exactly as you are. So let us begin by talking about ADHD itself. One of the key messages from my article is that ADHD in children remains widely misunderstood. And I think one of the reasons this conversation matters so much at the moment is because ADHD has become an increasingly polarised topic publicly. There's been a great deal of discussion around whether ADHD is being overdiagnosed, particularly in children. But when we actually look at the evidence, the reality appears very different. We know ADHD remains significantly under-recognised and underdiagnosed, particularly in girls, those who mask symptoms well, and children whose difficulties are misattributed to anxiety, trauma, or behavioural problems. The danger is that public scepticism can sometimes make families feel judged or dismissed when they're simply trying to understand why their child is struggling. And I think we need to move away from asking, are we diagnosing too many children, and instead ask, how many children are still being missed, misunderstood, or unsupported? Many children are still labelled naughty, disruptive, lazy, or difficult before anyone stops to ask whether there may be an underlying neurodevelopmental explanation for what we are seeing. ADHD exists within the broader framework of neurodiversity, and neurodiversity recognises that brains work differently and that conditions such as ADHD are not simply deficits to be fixed, but differences in how people experience the process and process the world. That does not mean there are no challenges, there absolutely are. For example, children with ADHD may struggle with attention, impulsivity, emotional regulation, executive functioning, and relationships. At the same time, many are also incredibly creative, energetic, curious, funny, and deeply passionate about their interests. One of the biggest challenges with ADHD is that many traits can initially appear like normal childhood behaviour. Lots of children are energetic, lots are distractible, lots struggle with concentration at times. What separates ADHD is the intensity, persistence, and impact those traits have across multiple areas of life. For example, children with inattentive ADHD may appear dreamy, forgetful, or disengaged. They may lose things constantly, struggle to complete tasks, or appear not to listen even when they're trying very hard. Children with hyperactive or impulsive ADHD may fidget constantly, interrupt others, struggle to sit still, or act before thinking. And many children have a combined presentation with both inattentive and hyperactive traits. One area I think we still get wrong far too often is recognising ADHD in girls. Girls frequently present differently. For example, instead of obvious hyperactivity, many internalise their difficulties. They may appear anxious, emotionally overwhelmed, or quietly inattentive. Many also become very skilled at masking their difficulties. Masking is something we are increasingly recognising clinically. For example, some children spend all day trying to appear calm, compliant, and socially acceptable in school environments, only to emotionally collapse once they get home because they're exhausted from holding everything together. That discrepancy can leave parents feeling invalidated and unheard. And I think listening carefully to families is absolutely critical. Parents usually know when something is not right long before formal recognition appears. The article discusses the fictional case of Ella, whose emotional dysregulation and school difficulties were repeatedly misunderstood. What struck me while writing that section was just how many children are still being mislabelled. For example, their behaviour may be blamed on parenting. Their emotional distress may be attributed solely to anxiety. Their struggles may be dismissed as laziness or defiance. Meanwhile, the child themselves is often becoming increasingly anxious, isolated, and emotionally exhausted. ADHD also rarely exists in isolation. For example, many children experience co-occurring anxiety, low mood, learning difficulties, or other neurodevelopmental differences. One of the most important points I wanted to make in the article is that unsupported ADHD can have profound emotional consequences over time. Children who repeatedly feel misunderstood often begin internalising negative messages about themselves. For example, they may begin believing they are too much, too emotional, too disorganised, too difficult, or simply not good enough. And over time, that can profoundly damage self-esteem. The article discusses how anxiety, panic attacks and depression can emerge when children's ADHD remains unsupported. As both a GP and a parent, I think emotional regulation remains one of the most misunderstood aspects of ADHD. People often assume ADHD is simply about concentration. It is not. For many children, emotional dysregulation is one of the most impairing parts of the condition. For example, small frustrations can feel enormous. Transitions can feel overwhelming. Rejection can feel devastating. And emotions are often experienced with extraordinary intensity. Another hugely important issue is the impact on families. Families are often exhausted. They're firefighting constantly. For example, they may be juggling school meetings, referrals, CAMHS waiting lists, emotional outbursts, and the challenge of simply trying to hold family life together while also advocating continuously for their child. Many parents feel isolated. Many blame themselves. Many feel judged by schools, professionals, or even wider family members. One thing I've learned personally is just how important validation is. Sometimes families do not immediately need solutions. They need someone to say, "I believe you. This sounds incredibly hard. You're not failing as a parent." And I think this is especially important in the current NHS landscape because families are often waiting a very long time for formal assessment or specialist input. A diagnosis is important, but support should never be completely dependent on a diagnostic label. We need to move towards a far more needs-led approach. If a child is struggling emotionally, academically, or socially, they deserve support regardless of whether they are still waiting for CAMHS, paediatrics, or a formal ADHD assessment. Too often families feel stuck in limbo. Schools sometimes say they need a diagnosis before adjustments can be made. Parents are told to wait for specialist input. Meanwhile, the child continues struggling every single day. But children do not stop needing support simply because they're on a waiting list. As GPs, even when specialist services are overwhelmed, we can still play an enormously important role. For example, we can listen, validate concerns, provide psychoeducation, and support families while they wait for specialist assessment. We can help schools understand that neurodevelopmental needs exist before formal diagnosis. We can encourage practical adjustments early rather than waiting months or years for paperwork. And often, relatively small interventions can make a very meaningful difference. For example, some children benefit enormously from consistent routines, visual structure, movement breaks during the school day, predictable transitions, or breaking larger tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. Others may need support with emotional regulation, sensory overwhelm, or reducing shame around behaviour. We can also support mental health while children wait. For example, many children with ADHD experience secondary anxiety because they spend years feeling misunderstood or constantly corrected. Sometimes helping a child feel understood is therapeutic in itself. Schools also play a crucial role. When schools understand neurodiversity well, outcomes improve dramatically. Children need environments where they feel understood rather than constantly corrected. Sometimes relatively small accommodations can completely transform a child's experience of school. For example, that may include movement opportunities during lessons, more flexible approaches to learning, predictable routines, sensory awareness or access to safe emotional spaces when children become overwhelmed. And importantly, support should be individualised. Not every child with ADHD struggles in the same way. For example, some children struggle academically, others socially, others emotionally. Some mask brilliantly in school and fall apart at home. Some present primarily with anxiety. Some become oppositional because they're overwhelmed. This is why a needs-led approach matters so much. Children are not checklists, they're individuals, and the support offered should reflect the child sitting in front of us, not simply whether they meet a narrow threshold for referral. Importantly, parents and schools should not feel like adversaries. The best outcomes happen when everyone works collaboratively around the child. We also need to be honest about the state of services. CAMS pathways are overwhelmed. ADHD referrals continue to rise. Waiting lists are extensive. Families are often left in limbo for months or years. GPs themselves are also working under enormous pressure trying to support children while specialist systems struggle to cope. This is not about blaming individual professionals. It's about recognising that demand has outgrown capacity. The real tragedy is not recognising these children too early, it's recognising them too late. Because by the time many children are finally identified, they may already have years of anxiety, educational struggles, and damaged self-esteem behind them. That is why early understanding matters. Not because every child needs medication, not because every child needs a label immediately, but because understanding changes trajectories. Children who understand themselves earlier are far less likely to grow believing they are broken. And perhaps that is the message I want to end on today. Different does not mean broken. Children with ADHD are often incredibly creative, funny, passionate, and resilient. The goal is not to erase difference. The goal is to support children so they can thrive as themselves. As clinicians, educators, and parents, we need to create environments where children feel safe, understood, and valued. And for parents listening today who are struggling, please trust your instincts. If something does not feel right, keep asking questions, keep advocating, and most importantly, remember that your child is not difficult for the sake of being difficult. Often, they are simply trying to navigate a world that was never designed with their brain in mind. Thank you for listening.